I still replay that night in my head more often than I'd like. No matter how many years pass, every detail stays sharp, like my mind refuses to let me forget what almost happened. I was 17, living with my mom and younger brother in a quiet neighborhood outside Boise, Idaho. Nothing exciting ever happened there. Everyone knew each other, people left bicycles on their front lawns, and neighbors borrowed sugar without knocking twice. One Friday evening, my mom had to drive 3 hours away because my grandfather had suffered a stroke. She took my little brother with her, asking if I'd be okay staying home until Sunday afternoon. I was thrilled. Not because I wanted to throw a party, but because my boyfriend, Ethan, and I had been planning to spend an evening together without constantly checking over our shoulders. We'd been dating for almost a year, and this would be the first time we'd have the house to ourselves. After my family left, Ethan called. "I'll come over around 11, he whispered. "My parents think I'm sleeping over at Jake's." I laughed and told him I'd leave the side door unlocked so he could sneak in quietly. He promised he'd text me when he arrived. The evening felt strangely peaceful. I watched a movie, cleaned the kitchen, fed the dog, and locked every window except the side entrance I had promised to leave open. Before going upstairs, I glanced outside. Across the street, Mr. Harlan was watering his flowers, even though it was nearly dark. He smiled and waved. I waved back. He'd lived there for as long as I could remember. He was retired, always friendly, and everyone called him the nicest man on the block. Around 10:30, I took a shower, changed into my pajamas, and climbed into bed. I kept checking my phone every few minutes, waiting for Ethan's message. Eventually, I must have drifted off. I woke to the sound of footsteps. At first, I smiled. Ethan. I assumed he'd quietly come upstairs after letting himself inside. Still half asleep, I whispered his name. No answer. The footsteps stopped beside my bed. I could hear someone breathing. I reached toward the edge of the mattress, expecting him to grab my hand. Instead, I felt rough fingertips slowly brushing against my wrist. The touch didn't feel familiar. It lingered far too long. A cold feeling spread through my chest. I opened my eyes. The room was dark, except for a little moonlight coming through the curtains. Someone was standing beside my bed. Not Ethan. An older man. He leaned over me with a smile that made my stomach turn. His face looked strangely calm, almost pleased that I'd finally opened my eyes. For a second, I couldn't even breathe. Then I recognized him. Mr. Harlan. Our neighbor. The man who had watched me grow up. He quietly raised one finger to his lips. "Don't scream," he whispered. "I just wanted to see you." Every muscle in my body locked. "What are you doing?" I managed to whisper. He smiled wider. "You've gotten so grown up." The words made me feel sick. I jerked backward and started screaming. His expression changed instantly. The calm disappeared. He lunged toward me, trying to cover my mouth, but I kicked him as hard as I could. He stumbled into my desk, knocking over my lamp. At that exact moment, my phone lit up on the nightstand. Ethan was calling. The ringtone echoed through the room. Mr. Harlan looked at the phone, then back at me. He knew someone else was coming. I answered without taking my eyes off him. "Ethan," I screamed. "Call 911. He's in my house." Mr. Harlan cursed under his breath. He rushed toward the bedroom door. As he reached the hallway, the front door slammed downstairs. Ethan had ignored my instructions to use the side entrance and came through the front instead. They met halfway up the stairs. I heard shouting, then a loud crash. I ran into the hallway, just in time to see Mr. Harlan shove Ethan against the wall before racing down the stairs. He disappeared out the side door into the darkness. Ethan chased him for a few seconds before stopping and coming back. He found me shaking so badly I couldn't even stand. Within minutes, police cars filled the street. Officers searched the neighborhood for hours. Mr. Harlan wasn't home. The next morning, they arrested him at a motel nearly 50 miles away. The investigation uncovered something that terrified me even more. He had been watching my house for weeks. He knew my family's schedule. He knew my mom worked weekends. He even knew Ethan drove a blue pickup. Police later found a notebook inside his garage, filled with pages describing my daily routine. There were dates, times, what clothes I wore, when I walked the dog, when I left for school. There were even notes about which bedroom light turned off first each night. The detectives believed he'd entered my house expecting to find me asleep and alone. They couldn't prove what he planned to do after that. I don't think I want to know. My family moved less than 2 months later. People still ask why we left such a quiet neighborhood. I never tell them the whole story. Because sometimes the person everyone trusts the most is simply the one who's had the longest time to hide who they really are. 3 years ago, something standing in an apartment window saved a man's life. To this day, I still can't explain what I saw, and I'm not sure I ever want to. At the time, I was living by myself in an old apartment building in Missoula, Montana. It wasn't a fancy place, but it was quiet. The kind of building where everyone nodded politely in the hallway and then disappeared behind their doors. I liked the routine. Nothing unexpected ever happened there. One rainy Thursday night, I left around 11 to grab coffee from a 24-hour gas station a few blocks away. The sidewalks were empty, and the rain had driven everyone indoors. By the time I got back, my clothes were damp and the parking lot was completely silent. As I walked toward the entrance, I suddenly felt like someone was staring at me. It wasn't fear exactly, more like that strange instinct that makes you look over your shoulder for no reason. I turned around. Nobody. The parking lot was empty. Then, without thinking, I looked up toward the 4th floor. One apartment window was brightly lit. A woman stood behind the glass. She wasn't moving. She simply stood there, looking directly at me through the rain-streaked window. She wore a long gray nightgown, and her pale face seemed almost colorless beneath the apartment light. One hand rested against the window, while the other slowly lifted as if she were trying to get my attention. I hesitated. Then I gave a small wave. She didn't wave back. Instead, she slowly pointed toward the apartment next to hers. Then the light inside her apartment suddenly went out.
The window became completely black. I stared for several seconds. Something about it didn't make sense. The building's lights were old, but they never shut off that quickly. I finally walked inside, trying to convince myself I'd imagined the whole thing. As I stepped into the lobby, I checked the tenant directory beside the mailboxes. Apartment 408, the apartment where I'd seen the woman. My stomach tightened. I remembered that apartment had been empty for months. The elderly woman who had lived there had died during the winter. Her family cleaned the place out shortly afterward, and nobody had rented it since. I stood there staring at the directory until another thought crossed my mind. The woman hadn't been pointing at me. She'd been pointing at the apartment next door, apartment 409. Mr. Alvarez lived there alone. He was in his 70s and always spent his evenings listening to old jazz records with the windows cracked open. Without really thinking about it, I took the elevator upstairs. The 4th floor hallway felt strangely quiet. Too quiet. As I reached apartment 409, I noticed the front door wasn't fully closed. It was open just enough to leave a narrow gap. That wasn't like Mr. Alvarez. He was almost obsessive about locking his door. I knocked. Nothing. I called his name. Still nothing. After a few seconds, I carefully pushed the door open. The apartment was dark except for a lamp lying on its side across the living room floor. Furniture had been overturned. Broken glass covered the carpet. There was a metallic smell in the air that immediately made my stomach twist. I pulled out my phone and called 911 while stepping farther inside.
As I spoke to the dispatcher, I heard a faint sound. 3 slow knocks. Not from the front door. From somewhere deeper inside the apartment. I followed the sound toward the bedroom. The closet door moved slightly. I opened it. Mr. Alvarez fell forward into my arms. His wrists were tied with extension cords, and a strip of duct tape hung around his neck where he'd managed to tear it loose. His face was bruised, but he was alive. He kept trying to say something, but he was too exhausted. The police arrived within minutes. Paramedics treated him while detectives searched the apartment. Later, they discovered 2 burglars had broken in looking for cash they believed he kept hidden in the apartment. When he refused to tell them where it was, they beat him, tied him up inside the closet, and fled after believing he would eventually die there. The detective later told me that if I'd arrived even 30 minutes later, Mr. Alvarez probably wouldn't have survived. The next afternoon, I asked one of the officers something I couldn't stop thinking about. Did anyone ever figure out who was inside apartment 408 last night? He frowned. There wasn't anyone in there. I explained about the woman in the window. He checked with the property manager. The apartment had been locked and completely empty for over 6 months. A week later, maintenance workers finally unlocked it for renovations. Out of curiosity, I looked inside. The rooms were empty. Dust covered every surface, except one window. The glass where I'd seen the woman was perfectly clean. There was a single handprint pressed against it from the inside. No one could explain how it got there. Mr. Alvarez moved away shortly after recovering. Before he left, he thanked me for saving my life. I wanted to tell him it wasn't really me. Someone else made sure I looked up that night. And whatever was standing behind that window wasn't trying to frighten me. It was trying to make sure I arrived before it was too late.
Last week, I buried my dog. His name was Shadow. He wasn't just a pet. He had been beside me for almost 15 years, through every major moment of my life. As I stood beside the small grave in my parents' backyard, holding his worn leather collar, I realized something I'd never truly said out loud. I wouldn't be alive if it weren't for him. That memory has followed me ever since I was 10 years old. Back then, we lived in a small town outside Duluth, Minnesota, where the woods started just beyond the last row of houses. At night, the forest became a wall of darkness that seemed to swallow every sound. One October evening, my parents drove 2 hours away to visit my grandmother after she was admitted to the hospital. They expected to be back before morning and left me with Shadow, a large black Labrador who never left my side. Before they drove away, my dad reminded me to lock every door and keep the curtains closed. I promised I would. The first few hours were easy. I watched television, made microwave popcorn, and let Shadow curl up beside the couch. Every now and then, he'd lift his head toward the front window, staring into the darkness outside before settling back down. Around midnight, the power flickered. The television shut off for a second before coming back on. Shadow immediately stood up. His ears pointed toward the back of the house. He didn't bark. He simply listened. Then I heard it. 3 soft knocks. Not at the front door, at the kitchen window. My stomach tightened. Nobody ever came to our house that late. I froze on the couch. Another 3 knocks. Slow, evenly spaced. Shadow walked between me and the hallway leading to the kitchen. The hair along his back stood straight up. He let out a deep growl I'd never heard before. I grabbed my phone to call my parents. No signal. The storm outside had apparently knocked out the service.
The house suddenly felt much smaller. Then came another sound. The back door handle. Someone was trying it. Slowly. Carefully. The lock rattled once. Then again. I backed away from the hallway, my hands shaking. The handle stopped moving. For several long seconds, everything became silent. Then I heard footsteps. Inside the house. Someone had found another way in. The footsteps moved across the kitchen floor. They were slow, deliberate, coming closer. Shadow stepped forward until he completely blocked the hallway. His growl became louder. A shadow stretched across the floor before I ever saw the person. Then a man stepped into view. He wore a dark hooded jacket and dirty work boots. His face was hidden beneath the hood. He looked directly at me. "There you are," he said quietly. He started walking toward me. I couldn't move. My legs refused to listen. The man reached out as if grabbing a child was the most ordinary thing in the world. Before his hand touched me, Shadow exploded forward. He slammed into the man's chest with enough force to knock him backward. The man crashed into the hallway wall. Shadow clamped onto his arm and refused to let go. The man screamed. He punched Shadow again and again, trying to free himself.
But Shadow held on. Furniture crashed over. Pictures fell from the walls. The entire house echoed with the struggle. Finally, the man reached for something in his pocket. A folding knife. Before he could open it, bright headlights swept across the front windows. A neighbor had pulled into his driveway after hearing the noise. The man looked toward the light. Then he shoved Shadow away with all his strength and ran toward the back of the house. A second later, the back door slammed shut. He was gone. I dropped to my knees beside Shadow. He was breathing hard. There was blood on his shoulder where the knife had barely grazed him. I wrapped my arms around him and cried until the neighbors came running inside. The police searched the woods until sunrise. They found footprints leading away from our neighborhood, but they never found the man. Detectives believed it had been an attempted abduction. If Shadow hadn't attacked when he did, they believed I would have been taken before anyone knew I was missing. Shadow recovered after surgery. He carried a scar on his shoulder for the rest of his life. Every night after that, he slept beside my bedroom door instead of at the foot of my bed. It was like he had decided his job wasn't finished. Years passed. I grew older. I moved away, started a career, got married. Wherever I lived, Shadow always found a place beside the front door, quietly watching anyone who came inside. Last week, age finally caught up with him. As I knelt beside him during his final moments, he looked at me with the same calm eyes he'd had that night so many years ago. I thanked him for saving my life. I don't know if dogs understand every word we say, but I know he understood my voice. Sometimes, when the house is quiet late at night, I still catch myself expecting to hear his paws walking across the floor. Part of me hopes I always will. Because even now, it still feels like Shadow is standing between me and whatever might be waiting in the dark.